black pilot was asked by airline staff to wait outside, and a few minutes later, he brought the company to its knees. Michael Daniels walked down the hallway of O'Hare International Airport, his uniform sharp and flawless, with 4 gold stripes on his sleeves symbolizing his rank as captain. At 37, with 15,000 flight hours and having served in the U.S. Air Force with 3 tours in Afghanistan, he was not just an excellent pilot, he was a man who lived for the skies. Today was his first official flight as captain with Meridian Airlines, one of the most prestigious airlines in the United States. But when he entered the crew briefing room, things didn't go as expected. CEO Thomas Barrett and Captain Richard Whitmore were already there, their faces cold, their gazes sharp as knives. Before Michael could greet them, Barrett spoke. "Captain Daniels, please wait outside." His words were as sharp as a blade. Michael furrowed his brow. "Excuse me, but I'm the captain of this flight. There must be some misunderstanding," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. No one responded immediately. The silence in the room was thick as lead. He could feel an invisible wave of tension, as all the other pilots and flight attendants in the room quietly avoided eye contact. Some glanced up, others lowered their heads to the flight plan, as if they didn't want to get involved. After a few awkward seconds, Barrett cleared his throat. "There's been a change of plans. Today, Captain Whitmore will be flying this route. You'll be reassigned to another task." Michael looked straight at Whitmore. The salt-and-pepper-haired man had a half-smile, but his eyes were empty and cold. "I'm sure you don't mind, Daniels," Whitmore said, his tone polite but dripping with sarcasm. Michael tightened his grip on the handle of his flight bag. He wasn't a rookie pilot, he knew how the airline industry worked. There was no way they would suddenly switch a captain right before a flight without a special reason, and certainly not in such a sudden and unexplained manner. "I was assigned as the captain for this flight weeks ago. I've fully prepared. Can you tell me why this is happening?" Michael asked, maintaining a professional tone, though his doubt was clear. Barrett glanced at Whitmore before responding in a mechanical tone. "We reassessed and decided that, for today's route, we need someone with more experience in Meridian's procedures." "With all due respect," Michael said, feeling his anger begin to flare inside his chest, "I have over 15,000 flight hours, including hundreds of landings at San Francisco under complex weather conditions. I am more than qualified." Barrett shrugged, his eyes as cold as steel. "This is not up for debate. You're asked to wait outside." Michael looked around. No one in the room dared to speak up. Some of the younger pilots looked uncomfortable but said nothing. A few flight attendants exchanged glances, but no one dared speak out. Michael immediately understood what was happening. He wasn't the first black person to be removed from a flight at the last minute. He took a deep breath. Taking a step back didn't mean giving up. "Very well," Michael said, his voice calm to the point of being frightening. He placed the flight documents on the table and slowly buttoned his uniform. Before leaving the room, he turned back to look at Whitmore, his gaze sharp as if to memorize the man's face forever. "Safe flight," Michael said, then walked out. The door slammed shut behind him, but this wasn't the end. Standing outside in the empty hallway, Michael clenched his fists, his gaze turning steely. He wasn't someone who could be easily defeated. "If they think I'm going to give up, they've picked the wrong guy. You're not the first captain to be treated like this." Michael stepped out of the flight crew meeting room, and the cold airport corridor at O'Hare felt colder than ever. Avoiding glances, tense faces brushed past him, as if no one wanted to be associated with what had just happened. No one spoke up to defend him. No one opposed the recent decision. A terrifying silence, heavier than any public insult. A few minutes later, the new assignment list arrived on his phone. Instead of being the captain for the San Francisco flight, he was reassigned to fly with Captain Harold Wilson, a veteran pilot with nearly 30 years of experience, famous for his disdain for black pilots and for opposing any efforts to diversify the airline industry. Michael knew Wilson well. His name often came up in private conversations, with stories of him publicly mocking young black pilots, opposing women sitting in the captain's seat, and frequently expressing conservative views about how the airline should operate. Wilson didn't need to say much. His nature was clear through his actions, deliberately hindering people like Michael from getting ahead. Michael entered the cockpit to find Wilson already seated in the captain's chair. The man, over 60 with salt and pepper hair, didn't even bother to turn around when Michael walked in. He only glanced at him through the rearview mirror in the cockpit, curling his lips with disdain, then turned back to the control panel as if Michael's presence didn't matter. "Just sit down, watch, and learn if you can," Wilson said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Michael didn't reply, silently sitting in the co-pilot seat. He was too familiar with people like Wilson, those who thought they owned the sky, who decided who deserved to fly and who didn't. During the pre-flight check, Wilson didn't interact with Michael. He spoke to the flight attendants, communicated with air traffic control, but never once asked for Michael's opinion or included him in the preparations. To anyone looking on, it would seem like Michael was just a trainee, not a seasoned pilot who had flown military planes through the most brutal war zones in the world. The contempt was clear and blatant. The Boeing 737 pushed back from the gate, taxiing to the runway, and took off into the sky. Michael quietly observed Wilson's every move, not missing a single detail. Wilson was experienced, no doubt about it, but he also had a habit of arrogance, dismissing every procedure he deemed unnecessary. By the time they were preparing to land in Denver, Wilson's overconfidence almost caused a serious accident. As they were preparing to approach the runway, Wilson entered the wrong frequency for air traffic control, making it impossible for the control tower to send accurate wind direction and landing conditions. It was a mistake that could have been dangerous, especially with the unstable weather conditions. Michael immediately noticed. "Captain Wilson, the Denver control tower frequency is not 124.75, it's 128.35. Wilson frowned, glancing at the control panel. For a moment, he realized he had entered the wrong frequency. Without saying a word, he quietly corrected it just as the control tower began calling their aircraft urgently. The silence was heavy in the cockpit. Wilson knew that if Michael hadn't caught it in time, they might have lost control tower contact at a crucial moment. He couldn't deny that. After landing safely, as the plane taxied to the gate, Wilson finally spoke. "Not bad," he said slowly, his tone heavy as if each word was a stone hard to swallow. "But you will never be a real captain at Meridian." The words didn't surprise Michael, but they reinforced what he had known all along. Wilson and people like him would never let a pilot like him have a chance to advance. "You're right about one thing," Michael replied, his tone even but his eyes cold. "I won't become a captain the way you want. But I won't stop just because you try to block my way." Wilson sneered, but his eyes betrayed his true emotions: discomfort, impatience, and perhaps a little worry. Michael had nothing more to say. He unbuckled his seatbelt, gathered his documents, and left the cockpit, leaving behind a stifling atmosphere. When he entered the pilot lounge, Michael heard a quiet voice from behind. "You're not the first captain to be treated like this." He turned around to see James Chen, a young Asian pilot with watchful eyes. "What do you mean?" Michael asked. James quickly glanced around before answering. In the past 3 years, I've seen at least 4 new captains kicked off their first flight without any good reason. 3 of them were black, and the 4th was a woman. And what happened to them? James sighed. 2 gave up and moved to other airlines. 1 was permanently assigned to short-haul domestic routes. The last one, I heard he filed a complaint, but just a few months later he vanished from the pilot roster. No one knows what happened. Michael tightened his grip on his document bag, feeling a simmering wave of anger rise in his chest. "What are you going to do?" James asked. Michael looked towards the windows, where Meridian Airlines planes were lined up waiting for takeoff. "I don't know yet," he said, but deep down, he already had his answer. He wouldn't let this pass like the others before him. Someone once tried to expose the truth, and he's no longer working here. Michael fell silent at James's words. The oppressive feeling that had built up inside him since being removed from the first flight now had a clearer explanation. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a system, a process of excluding those who didn't meet the standards the company had implicitly set before. He didn't respond to James immediately, only nodded, as if to confirm that he had heard and understood. But inside, he knew he needed to dig deeper. The only remaining question: what else are they hiding besides discrimination? That evening, as O'Hare Airport gradually quieted down after the last flights of the day, Michael quietly walked through the maintenance area. This wasn't a place pilots usually frequented, but he had a valid reason to be there. Marcus Jefferson, one of Meridian's longtime maintenance technicians, was standing next to a Boeing 737, inspecting the engine with a thoughtful look. He was a middle-aged man, with the calloused hands of someone who had spent their entire life with these giant machines. When he saw Michael approaching, Marcus wasn't surprised. He just glanced at him, as if he had already expected this meeting. "You're not the first person to get kicked off their first flight," Marcus started without preamble. Michael didn't react right away. He knew people like Marcus. They didn't waste words. If he spoke, it meant he had something important to say. "I know," Michael replied, "but it seems like this isn't just about discrimination, is it?" Marcus sighed, pushed aside the oil rag, and looked directly into Michael's eyes. "Meridian Airlines doesn't just have a problem with you. They're hiding a very big secret." Michael shivered. He waited for Marcus to continue, and what he was about to hear would forever change the way he viewed this airline. "Have you ever heard of Paul Decker?" Marcus asked in a low voice. Michael shook his head. "He used to be one of the best maintenance engineers I've ever known," Marcus continued. "Worked here for over 20 years, never missed a technical flaw, no matter how small. But that's also why he was pushed out of the game." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked around, then lowered his voice as if afraid someone might hear. "Paul discovered a serious issue on several of Meridian's planes, a flaw in the cabin pressure valve system. If not fixed properly, it could lead to a loss of pressure mid-flight, causing passengers and crew to lose consciousness in a few minutes. An accident like that could kill hundreds of people." Michael held his breath. This wasn't a small flaw. It was a potential disaster. "Did he report it?" "Yes, but the problem is—" Marcus paused, his gaze sharp. His report never made it to the FAA. Michael stared at Marcus. It disappeared. It was blocked before it could be sent. So, what happened to Paul? This time, Marcus didn't answer right away. He just looked down at his hands, the oil stains deep in the creases, evidence of decades spent working in this industry. Finally, he took a deep breath. 3 weeks after he reported the issue, Paul had an accident. What kind of accident? Marcus clenched his fists, his eyes showing clear anger. He fell from a maintenance platform more than 6 meters high, broke both his legs and his back, permanently damaging his spine. The company called it a personal error, saying he didn't follow safety procedures. But I knew Paul. He always worked step by step, never careless. What you're saying is... Michael trailed off, but both of them understood the hidden meaning. Marcus nodded slowly. I can't prove it, but I know something's not right. After the accident, the company fired him without any compensation, and no one ever mentioned his report again. And what about the plane with the technical flaw? Marcus tightened his helmet strap. It's still flying, and not just one. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. If what Marcus was saying was true, then dozens, maybe hundreds of flights were taking off every day on planes that could suffer a cabin pressure failure. Do you have any proof? He asked. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. I've kept some documents. Not everything, but enough to prove the company is hiding something. I need to see them, Michael said immediately, his voice showing urgency. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small USB drive from his jacket pocket and placed it in Michael's hand. This is part of it, but you have to be careful. If they catch you with this, I don't know what they'll do. Michael looked at the USB in his palm, feeling its weight heavier than anything he had ever held. Thank you, Marcus, he said sincerely. Marcus nodded, but before leaving, he left one last piece of advice. You've been noticed, Daniels. If you plan to go all the way, be prepared. Michael stood there for a long time, feeling the air around him suddenly become dense, as if he had just stepped into a storm with no way out. For the first time since joining Meridian Airlines, he understood that this wasn't just a fight for personal fairness. This was a fight for the survival of thousands of people. And he had no intention of backing down. If you want to know the truth, meet me in the maintenance storage after hours. Michael left the maintenance area with the small USB securely tucked in his pocket. While his outward demeanor remained calm, inside, a storm was brewing. What Marcus had just revealed wasn't simply a matter of negligence or technical error. It was a deliberate system designed to conceal the truth, putting hundreds of lives at risk. The scariest part was the silence. If Paul Decker had tried to blow the whistle on this and ended up with an accident, it meant those behind it weren't afraid to use any means necessary to silence anyone who dared to speak out. And now, Michael had one foot in the battle, but he couldn't act immediately. If he rushed into things, he'd become the next target. So, he decided to play the role of someone resigned, someone who knew their place. In the days that followed, Michael showed up at Meridian Airlines headquarters as usual. He took short-haul flight assignments, kept a calm demeanor, and drew no attention to himself. Wilson and Barrett continued to test him. They assigned him boring flights, low-priority domestic routes, hoping he'd grow disheartened and quit on his own. But Michael didn't react. He needed time. Each time he checked a plane before takeoff, he secretly recorded its flight number and cross-checked it with the data Marcus had provided. Gradually, he began to notice a pattern. Planes previously reported with serious technical issues continued flying without any signs of repairs. Maintenance reports were altered, inspection dates changed, major faults were downgraded to minor, insignificant issues. The internal maintenance system showed signs of manipulation, with mandatory checks being skipped without valid reason. Every small detail reinforced his belief that Paul Decker had been right. Meridian Airlines was covering up a massive conspiracy, and if no one exposed it, the consequences were just a matter of time. But Marcus wasn't the only one he reached out to. One evening, while sitting in the crew lounge, Michael received a message from an unfamiliar number. "I have something. If you're serious about this, meet me at the third-floor cafe at 10 p.m. He didn't need to guess. He knew it was Lauren Kim, the flight attendant Marcus had mentioned. Lauren was an experienced flight attendant, but what made her special was that she wasn't the silent type. She had fought for the rights of flight attendants, reported safety violations, but she had learned that the system wasn't for those who dared to speak the truth. When Michael sat down at the table, Lauren slid a phone toward him. The screen showed a photo of the passenger cabin of a recent flight. There was a clear crack in the plane's ceiling near the emergency exit. "This is from Flight 336 to Toronto last month," Lauren said in a low voice. "We reported it right after landing, but the company still allowed that plane to take off again less than 3 hours later." Michael zoomed in on the photo. The crack wasn't small. It was a clear sign of structural failure that could lead to a loss of cabin pressure mid-air. "Do you know what they did?" he asked. Lauren scoffed, her eyes sharp. "They told us to stay quiet, erase the report from the internal system, and get back to work." Michael felt rage building inside him. They weren't just hiding technical errors, they were disregarding the lives of passengers. After the meeting, Michael began to feel the scrutiny growing more obvious. His internal emails were randomly checked, something that had never happened before. An unfamiliar IT employee appeared in the pilot's office to check the computer system. Wilson seemed more irritable than usual, though he still kept his calm exterior, his eyes scrutinizing him more than before. One day, while inspecting a plane, Michael noticed a man standing at a distance, watching him for far too long. The man wasn't wearing a pilot or technician uniform. He didn't move. And when Michael got closer, the man turned and left the maintenance area without saying a word. For the first time, Michael realized that he had truly attracted the attention of those behind this entire conspiracy. That night, Michael returned to his small apartment, placed Marcus's USB on the table, opened his laptop, and began compiling all the data he had. Falsified maintenance data from Marcus, ignored technical faults from Lauren, flights where faulty planes continued to operate. The bigger picture slowly came into focus. Meridian Airlines wasn't just covering up a small violation. They had created an entire fake maintenance system, operating planes that didn't meet safety standards, putting thousands of lives at risk every day. This was no longer a personal issue for him. It was a matter of life and death. He knew that if he stopped now, he'd become part of that deadly silence. He couldn't do that. He just caused a delay, Captain Daniels. Michael looked up from the cockpit controls, his gaze sharp and composed. In front of him stood Thomas Barrett, the CEO of Meridian Airlines, arms crossed as he leaned against the desk with an expression of deep displeasure. The small meeting room in the O'Hare Airport Operations Center was dimly lit by soft yellow lights, casting long shadows of Barrett on the table, creating a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. Michael knew why he had been summoned here, and he wasn't surprised. 3 hours earlier, while performing a pre-flight check for the Chicago to Las Vegas flight, Michael had noticed a series of irregularities in the maintenance log for the Boeing 737 he was about to pilot. The maintenance data clearly stated that the cabin pressure control valves had been inspected and confirmed to be up to technical standards just 2 days prior. But when he compared the serial numbers of the parts with the data Marcus had provided, he realized it was a blatant lie. The maintenance system had no record of any recent inspections. Furthermore, Michael discovered that this particular aircraft had previously been reported for structural defects, and it had not been repaired. He clenched the file in his hand. This was the moment where he had to make a choice. Either turn a blind eye like everyone else or take action. Without hesitation, Michael called in the maintenance crew for a full inspection. His decision immediately caused an uproar. The flight, which was scheduled to depart at 6:45 p.m., had not been cleared to leave the gate by 7:05 p.m. Warning lights on the internal system began flashing continuously as the maintenance team conducted manual checks. Passengers grew anxious, the flight attendants were confused, and the flight coordination team kept calling for updates on the delay. The atmosphere in the cockpit was so tense it was palpable with every hurried breath. James, Michael's co-pilot, leaned over and whispered, "Are you sure?" "They're not going to be happy about this." "I'm sure," Michael replied, never blinking. The flight was delayed by 20 minutes, but after the inspection, the maintenance crew confirmed that the cabin pressure control valve indeed had issues. Not only had it not been inspected, but it also showed signs of minor damage, which, if left undetected, could have caused a sudden loss of cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. A real disaster. They replaced the valve immediately, and the flight finally took off safely. But the consequences of his decision came faster than Michael had anticipated. Now, he stood facing Barrett, who glared at him with a razor-sharp stare. "Do you know how much your decision has cost us?" Barrett spat. "A 20-minute delay not only lost us thousands of dollars, but also damaged the company's reputation. That was a big mistake, Daniels." Michael stared back at Barrett, unwavering. "The only mistake was allowing an aircraft with technical faults to fly without a proper inspection," he replied coldly. Barrett leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk. "Listen up, Daniels. At Meridian, we have one principle: reliability and efficiency. If every pilot acted like you did today, our system would collapse. We have cross-checking procedures, specialized teams, and your job isn't to hunt for technical errors. It's to get the plane off the ground on time." "I have a more important duty," Michael interrupted, his eyes blazing with anger. "I am responsible for making sure every passenger on my plane gets home safely. If that means delaying the flight for a little while, then I accept that." Barrett sneered, a half-smile of contempt. "You're ruining your career, Daniels. This is a warning. Next time you delay a flight without a valid reason, I won't hesitate to show you the door." Michael didn't blink. A 20-minute delay is better than putting 100 lives in danger. For a moment, the room fell silent. Barrett slowly stood up, his eyes challenging. "We'll see how long you can resist this system." Michael stood up, buttoning his uniform jacket, his gaze steady. "We'll see," he replied, then turned and walked out of the room. He knew this was just the beginning of a real confrontation, and this time he had no choice but to see it through to the end. "Stop, or you'll end up like Paul Decker." Michael stepped out of Barrett's office, feeling the heavy, oppressive atmosphere surrounding him. The warnings didn't need to be spoken out loud, but the way his colleagues avoided eye contact and the scrutinizing looks from his superiors made it clear he had become a thorn in their side. If before they simply wanted him discouraged enough to leave on his own, now, after the decision to inspect the faulty airplane, everything had entered a new, far more dangerous phase. That evening, when he returned to his apartment, Michael tossed his leather briefcase onto the table, poured himself a glass of water, and was about to relax. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen, immediately feeling a chill run down his spine. A message from an unknown number appeared, simple and blunt enough to make his heart skip a beat. "Stop, or you'll end up like Paul Decker." He didn't need to read it again to know this wasn't an empty threat. Someone was watching him. Someone knew what he was trying to do. And more importantly, someone was ready to act if he didn't stop right now. Without responding, he locked the screen, removed the SIM card, and placed it in a cup of water on the table. The sensation of invisible eyes tracking him made it impossible to sit still. The apartment suddenly felt eerily silent. He walked over to the window, gently pulled back the curtain, and looked outside. A black car was parked across the street, engine still running, but no one was getting in or out. He stared at the car for a few more seconds before deciding to ignore it. If they wanted him to be afraid and back down, they had misjudged him. The next morning, when Michael walked into the flight operations area of Meridian Airlines, he immediately noticed the shift in how people were looking at him. Polite nods were still exchanged, but he could feel the clear distance between them. Some colleagues who used to chat with him now just looked past him and walked away. A few others silently stepped back as he passed by, as if not wanting to get involved in the trouble he was bringing with him. When he logged into the internal system to check the flight schedule, a strange message appeared on the screen. Your account is being monitored. All system activity will be recorded. Michael sat up straight, eyes fixed on the message. This wasn't the usual protocol. He tried opening his flight schedule. Everything seemed normal. But when he tried to access the maintenance system, a warning immediately appeared. You do not have access to this section. This was the first time his access had been restricted. They had placed him under surveillance. They weren't just trying to scare him with invisible threats. They were actively preventing him from accessing important information. From the corner of the room, a man in a white shirt, without any pilot or maintenance badges, walked past the rows of desks. He looked at Michael for a brief moment, just long enough to convey an unspoken message before turning and walking out. Michael didn't need to guess. They were officially monitoring him. As he changed into his uniform in the pilot's lounge, a low voice came from behind. Don't trust anyone, they're watching you. Michael turned around to see Peter Lawson, a young pilot with a tense expression standing near the door, his eyes clearly filled with concern. Why are you saying that? Michael asked, keeping his tone calm, but a sinking feeling began to form in his gut. I've worked here for 3 years. I've seen what they do to people who question this system. Peter lowered his voice, glancing toward the door as if worried someone might hear. What have they done? They find ways to eliminate them. Not always by firing them right away. Sometimes they make things so difficult that the person is forced to leave. Or worse. Michael frowned. Worse? Peter swallowed hard. Paul Decker wasn't the only one who had an accident here. Michael's heart slowed in his chest. Who are you talking about? Another maintenance engineer. I don't remember his name, but over a year ago, he found a problem with the navigation system in some older planes. He submitted a report, and less than a month later, he died in a car accident on his way to work. The police ruled it an accident due to loss of control, but there were too many things that didn't add up. Michael stared at Peter, his mind racing at full speed. If this was true, Meridian wasn't just covering up a technical fault. They were willing to do whatever it took to silence anyone who spoke out. Why are you telling me this? Because I know what you're doing, and if you're not careful, you'll be the next one. Michael kept his gaze on Peter's face for a few more seconds before slowly nodding. He wasn't surprised, but hearing this from a colleague made him more certain that he was on the right track. I understand. Peter hesitated for a long moment, as though he wanted to say more, but then silently walked away. Michael's next flight went as usual, but as soon as he entered the cockpit, he noticed something unusual. On the main screen, the cabin pressure warning system had been temporarily disabled. This wasn't something that could be easily turned off. It had to be done from the maintenance system. He called a technician to check it. A few minutes later, a maintenance worker returned with an awkward smile. "The system's fine, Captain Daniels. Maybe someone accidentally disabled it, but it's back online now." Michael stared at him. "Who disabled it?" The technician shook his head. "There are no records of that." Michael didn't say anything more, just nodded and turned back to his seat. But in his heart, he knew this wasn't just a malfunction. This was a warning, a reminder that he had gone too far, and now they wanted him to know it. He clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and then resolutely looked ahead. If they thought they could make him back down, they were wrong. If they were ready to take this battle to a dangerous level, so was he. "I need your help to bring this to light." Michael sat silently in his small apartment, his gaze fixed on the computer screen where a series of maintenance fraud documents from Meridian Airlines were neatly organized by category. The edited reports, the serious technical errors ignored, the evidence provided by Marcus and Lauren, all painted a clear picture of a system deliberately concealing misconduct, betting the lives of thousands of people. He knew he had gone too far to turn back now. The warnings from Peter, the anonymous messages, the tampered cockpit system, all pointed to one obvious conclusion. They knew he was trying to expose the truth, and if he didn't act first, they would find a way to eliminate him like they had with others. He opened his contacts and searched for a number he had saved but never thought he'd have to call. A moment of silence lingered before he decisively hit the call button. The other end picked up after 3 rings. "This is Zoe. What's going on?" Michael closed his eyes briefly and took a deep breath. "I need your help to bring this to light." Zoe Daniels was not just his sister. She was a well-known attorney specializing in corporate litigation. She had been involved in many high-profile lawsuits against major corporations, but even she never imagined that one day her brother would be the one calling with such a request. Michael recounted everything, from being removed from the first flight to the discoveries of maintenance fraud, the veiled threats, and finally the evidence he had gathered. When he finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "Do you realize that if you do this, your career is over?" Zoe asked, her voice calm but betraying her concern. Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think I still have a career? After everything that's happened, they're just waiting for the chance to boot me out. So, what do you want to do? I need you to connect me with a reliable investigative reporter. Someone who can bring this to light without them silencing them. And I also need to contact the FAA immediately." Zoe was silent for a few seconds. Then she sighed, her tone becoming more resolute. "All right, I'll handle that." 2 days later, Michael walked into a small cafe in downtown Chicago, where he was set to meet Sarah Mitchell, an investigative reporter from the Chicago Tribune. She was one of the most prominent journalists known for her work on corporate corruption, having helped uncover several major financial scandals. Sarah arrived on time, carrying a small briefcase and wearing the sharp look of a woman not easily swayed by lies. Michael placed a neatly arranged stack of documents in front of her. As she opened it and skimmed through the numbers, images, and leaked internal emails, he saw her eyes narrow. She grabbed a pen and quickly took notes on key points before looking up at him. "How sure are you that this data is accurate?" 100%, Michael replied without hesitation, "and I can provide more witnesses if needed." Sarah nodded, closing the briefcase. "Okay, but I need to verify everything before publishing. I'll contact the FAA for independent confirmation. If what you're saying is true, we're talking about one of the biggest aviation scandals in history." Michael tightened his fingers around his coffee cup. How long can you keep my identity a secret? Sarah smirked. Do you think you still have a secret identity? Trust me, if I have these documents, it means someone inside Meridian already knows what you're doing. The question isn't whether they'll come after you, but what they'll do next. At the same time, an official report was sent to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Michael knew that an anonymous letter wouldn't be enough. He needed to make this issue big enough that the FAA couldn't ignore it. He had gathered all the data Marcus had provided, compiled all the anomalies in the aircraft maintenance schedules, and attached testimonies from Lauren and other flight attendants. When he hit send, he felt a part of the pressure lift, but at the same time, an unsettling feeling crept in. If Meridian found out about this, they wouldn't let him go. 3 days later, the first article by the Chicago Tribune was published, starting with a headline that made waves. Meridian Airlines faces serious flight safety violations. Evidence from an insider whistleblower shows widespread cover-up. The article didn't mention his name, but the details were clear enough for anyone in the industry to guess who was behind the whistleblowing. The documents released were only a fraction of what he had provided, enough to pressure the FAA into opening an official investigation. Michael read the article, knowing that everything would change from here on out. There was no turning back. And then, as he had predicted, the phone on the pilot's break room desk rang. He picked up the phone, and a low voice came through the line. "We need to talk, Daniels, right now." Michael didn't need to ask who was calling. They had found him, and the real fight had only just begun. Sign a non-disclosure agreement or be fired immediately. The deep voice over the phone didn't introduce itself. Michael knew right away who was calling. They hadn't wasted much time acting. After the article in the Chicago Tribune, the atmosphere at Meridian Airlines changed drastically. Cold stares, conversations that abruptly stopped when he walked into the pilot lounge. Colleagues avoided him, as if he were carrying some invisible plague. Throughout his flying career, he had never felt so alone. That morning, a message was sent to his company phone. Report immediately to the executive meeting room on the 12th floor. Do not be late. He stared at the screen, his palm tightening unconsciously. They wouldn't let him leave so easily. When Michael entered the meeting room, the air inside was heavy as lead. A long, glass-topped table reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and familiar faces sat facing him. Thomas Barrett, the CEO, sat at the center with a blank expression. Next to him, Richard Whitmore and 2 company lawyers. In the corner of the room, Harold Wilson stood with his arms crossed, his cold eyes watching like a predator waiting for its prey to step into a trap. A chair was pulled out for him. Michael didn't sit down. Barrett slowly pushed a stack of documents toward him, his dull gray eyes never leaving Michael's face. "We'll get straight to the point." His voice was as sharp as a razor. "You've damaged Meridian Airlines' reputation. We're facing an investigation from the FAA and the potential loss of millions in stock value. However, we are willing to settle this matter quietly." He pushed the documents closer toward Michael. "Sign here, Daniels, and you'll leave quietly with a generous settlement. Otherwise, we'll have to take stronger measures." Michael glanced at the first page of the document. NDA, Non-Disclosure Agreement. A contract binding him to never disclose any information about what he knew forever. He looked up at them, realizing the certainty in their eyes that he would have no choice but to sign. He took a deep breath, then slowly pushed the documents back. "I didn't come here to sign anything." Barrett smirked, his gaze sharp as though assessing a pawn who didn't know its place. "Daniels, do you understand what's happening here?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're being watched by the FAA. You've made the media jump in, but let me tell you something. No one will care about these allegations in the long run. You have nothing but a few incomplete reports, some vague statements from low-level employees, and you're going up against a multi-billion-dollar airline. Do you really think you can win?" Michael held his gaze steadily. "I don't need to win. I just need the truth to be exposed." Whitmore chuckled softly, a cold laugh with no humor. "The truth?" He shook his head. "Daniels, you're naive. Look at what's happened to those before you. Do you really think you'll be the exception?" Michael leaned his hands on the table, his gaze sharp. "The FAA has received full evidence. They've launched an official investigation. The press has all your internal documents, and I have enough witnesses ready to testify in court. If Meridian doesn't act now, the truth will explode before the public." The atmosphere in the room suddenly became suffocating. The company's lawyers exchanged looks with Barrett, clearly caught off guard by how far Michael had gone. Barrett clenched his jaw, the calm in his eyes slowly turning into something far more dangerous. "Are you blackmailing us?" Michael shook his head. "Number. I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing." A minute of silence dragged on. Wilson stood up, leaning his hands on the table. "Do you think the FAA will do anything? A long investigation, maybe months, even years, and during that time we'll still be operating. What about you? Do you think any other airline would hire a traitor like you?" Michael didn't answer right away. He just stared directly into Wilson's eyes. "You know what's funny, Wilson? I don't care about my career anymore, but I do know one thing. You do." Barrett closed his eyes slightly as if trying to contain a surge of anger. When he opened his eyes again, his voice had turned cold. "Fine. If you want a war, Daniels, you'll have it. But I promise you, when this is over, you'll have nothing left." Michael smiled. "We'll see who loses more, Mr. Barrett." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind people trying to protect a system that was gradually collapsing. He knew he had crossed a line with no turning back. But he also knew that, right now, as the door behind him closed, a new era for Meridian Airlines was beginning. And it would no longer be under the control of those trying to silence the truth. All flights of Meridian Airlines are immediately suspended. Michael walked out of the meeting room, feeling the heavy pressure weighing down on the atmosphere around him. Even though no one said a word, he knew that he had put an end to the direct confrontation with the Meridian leadership. But this was not the conclusion. He didn't fool himself into thinking that those in power would quietly accept defeat. What they had just said was not merely a threat. It was a sign that they would fight to the bitter end to protect their empire. But so would he. The next morning, when he opened his eyes, the first news he saw was the bold headline on the news websites. FAA launches emergency investigation into Meridian Airlines. Dozens of flights affected. The FAA report had been officially released. Major news outlets were reporting on the flight safety scandal surrounding Meridian Airlines. Below the article, hundreds of comments from passengers, pilots, and internal staff began to appear, painting an even more chaotic picture than he had imagined. Meridian's booking system began to overload as passengers demanded refunds. Videos of angry passengers stranded at airports due to canceled flights started to go viral on social media. Meridian Airlines, once one of the largest carriers in the United States, was sinking into a full-blown crisis. The FAA didn't waste any time. Within 48 hours of the investigation's start, More than 40% of Meridian's fleet was grounded for a complete technical system inspection. Federal inspectors flooded the maintenance hangars, flipping through every file, checking every bolt on every plane. They didn't need Michael to say another word. The data he provided was enough to make them suspicious and find a host of new evidence. What they discovered was worse than Michael had imagined. A fake maintenance system had been in place for years. Inspection reports had been falsified to keep old planes flying, even though they no longer met safety standards. Critical parts, such as cabin pressure valves, fuel control systems, and landing sensors, had been replaced with cheap, unapproved components. A string of severe violations was laid bare, and the media quickly jumped into action. Major news outlets like CNN, The New York Times, and BBC ran headlines calling it one of the most serious aviation safety violations of the past decade. Passengers were panicking. Thousands were stranded at airports, waiting hopelessly as flights were canceled with no information from the airline. Videos of the chaos at customer service desks, where Meridian staff didn't know how to respond, quickly became the focus of social media. Meridian Airlines' stock plummeted, but the worst was yet to come. 3 days after the FAA's investigation was announced, the leadership of Meridian Airlines received an emergency summons from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Michael watched the press conference live on a TV in the pilot's lounge. When an FAA spokesperson stood at the podium and read the preliminary findings of the investigation, he knew the game was over. After a thorough examination, we have discovered numerous serious violations in Meridian Airlines' maintenance system. These actions not only violate federal regulations, but also endanger the lives of millions of passengers. As a result, effective immediately, the FAA has decided to suspend all operations of Meridian Airlines until the final results of the investigation are concluded. We will work closely with the Department of Justice to determine the criminal liability of those involved. The room fell silent. Michael closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Their empire had collapsed. Barrett, Whitmore, Wilson, and many other executives were immediately fired. But it didn't stop there. Less than a week later, they received subpoenas from the U.S. Department of Justice on charges of fraud, falsifying maintenance documents, and deliberately concealing aviation safety violations. For the first time in history, a major airline was facing criminal prosecution, and all those behind the system would have to pay the price. Michael didn't feel joy or satisfaction. He only felt relief. Not because he had won, but because, finally, innocent passengers no longer had to gamble with their lives every time they stepped onto a Meridian plane. 3 months later, as Michael sat on a bench at Chicago O'Hare Airport, he watched as employees replaced the Meridian Airlines signs. The familiar logo was taken down and replaced with another name: Atlantic Airways, the airline that had acquired Meridian's assets after its bankruptcy. A familiar voice rang out behind him. "Hey, you still want to keep flying?" Michael turned around to see James Chen standing there with a smile. "They're hiring pilots, and I hear you have quite an impressive resume." Michael chuckled, stood up, and for the first time in months he didn't feel like he was carrying an invisible burden. "I'm not sure, but I think I'll consider it." The sky was still there, vast and endless, but this time, as he returned to it, he would no longer be flying under the shadow of those willing to trade safety for profit. He would be flying in a sky that he had helped make safer. The aviation industry will never be the same again. Michael sat quietly in the pilot's lounge, gazing out the glass window where planes took off and landed one after another. The sky was as blue as ever, the metallic wings still soaring through the air, but there was one undeniable truth. The aviation industry had changed forever. The collapse of Meridian Airlines was not just the fall of a major corporation. It was a widespread shock that rocked the entire commercial aviation industry. Meridian had once been one of the oldest airlines in America, a symbol of stability and prestige. But now, that name was nothing more than a stain in history, a prime example of how greed and carelessness could lead to catastrophic consequences. When Atlantic Airways completed its acquisition of Meridian's assets, the former headquarters became one of the new training centers for pilots and technicians. What remained of Meridian was not its reputation or legacy, but a warning to all other airlines. If you gamble with human lives, you will pay the price. This event sparked an unprecedented wave of changes throughout the industry. The FAA, under pressure from the public and authorities, tightened regulations on maintenance and internal oversight for all airlines. There was no longer any room for falsification or overlooking violations. The U.S. Department of Transportation ordered a comprehensive review of all major commercial airlines. Within 6 months, many airlines faced surprise inspections, and some smaller ones were even grounded due to safety violations. One of the most important changes was the establishment of the National Aviation Safety Oversight Committee, an independent organization tasked with closely monitoring maintenance procedures, licensing, and incident reporting for airlines. This was something the aviation industry had never seen before, an independent watchdog not influenced by large corporations. Pilots, flight attendants, and technicians who had once been forced to remain silent about the safety risks now had protective mechanisms, thanks to a whistleblower law passed by Congress right after the Meridian scandal. No one could silence those who dared to speak up anymore. But not everyone embraced the change easily. In a federal court in Washington, D.C., the once powerful figures of Meridian Airlines now stood in front of the judge. Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitmore, Harold Wilson, and other executives faced numerous charges, including fraud, falsifying maintenance records, and intentionally concealing safety risks. The trial lasted for months, with a stream of former employees, pilots, and technicians taking the stand. Marcus Jefferson, who had helped Michael gather evidence, appeared and publicly exposed the system that coerced maintenance workers into falsifying data so planes could continue flying. Lauren Kim provided images and internal emails showing how the company deliberately ignored serious incident reports to avoid flight delays. Peter Lawson, who had warned Michael, also testified, confirming that Meridian's internal system tracked and threatened anyone who dared to speak out. Meanwhile, the press continuously reported on the trial, increasing public pressure. No one could hide the truth anymore. In the end, Thomas Barrett was sentenced to 20 years in prison for fraud and willfully concealing violations that endangered human lives. Richard Whitmore and Harold Wilson received lighter sentences, but all were permanently banned from participating in any activities related to the aviation industry. Those who once sat at the peak of power were now nothing but prisoners carrying a stain that could never be erased. Michael did not appear in court, but he followed the trial from a distance. He didn't want to be in the spotlight, didn't want to be a hero or a symbol. He only wanted to ensure that something like Meridian would never happen again. 6 months after Meridian's bankruptcy, Michael received an offer from Atlantic Airways. They wanted him to join their team of pilots, not just as a captain, but also as a safety consultant. He sat in front of the screen, staring at the email offer for a long while. He knew he still loved the sky, still longed for the feeling of piloting an aircraft gliding through the clouds. But he also knew he couldn't return to being just an ordinary pilot. The world had changed, and so had he. A year later, at the annual Aviation Safety Conference, a speaker was invited to address hundreds of representatives from major airlines around the world. Michael stepped up to the podium and looked down at the audience. They were waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to talk about what he had been through. But he didn't want to talk about the past anymore. He wanted to talk about the future. We have an inescapable responsibility to ensure that no airline can gamble with human lives the way Meridian did. We cannot let safety be a choice. It must be an unbreakable rule. I'm not standing here to revisit what happened. I'm standing here to make sure it will never happen again. As the applause echoed through the room, Michael saw faces in the crowd of those who had stood by him: Lauren, Marcus, James, Peter. Together, they had exposed a horrifying truth. And though they had to sacrifice much, they had done what few dared to do. The aviation industry was no longer the same, and that was their greatest victory. Do you want to be a captain at Atlantic? Michael stood by the window of his office, watching the planes take off from O'Hare Airport. The sky was the same, vast, endless, welcoming all those who dared to dream of reaching it. But his path was no longer just about piloting a plane. He was no longer just a pilot. He had become a guardian of the sky. Since the collapse of Meridian Airlines, Michael had received countless offers. Airlines wanted him as a captain. Aviation safety organizations wanted him as an advisor, and flight schools wanted him to teach. But the most important offer came from the FAA, a senior safety advisor position where he could directly contribute to shaping new regulations to prevent the mistakes Meridian had made. He knew this was his chance to create real change. Not just to expose a fraudulent airline, but to build a system where the truth couldn't be hidden, a place where pilots and technicians could speak out without fear of being silenced. He accepted the job, and over the past year, he had been involved in significant reforms, helping the FAA tighten safety standards, implement independent inspection processes, and ensure that people like Barrett, Whitmore, or Wilson would never have the chance to run an airline again. But the sky still called to him. One day, as he was checking his email, he noticed a new message from his former colleague, James Chen. Atlantic Airways is looking for an experienced captain to train the next generation of pilots. They want you. Are you interested? Michael leaned back in his chair, thinking. He remembered the days spent in the cockpit, the feeling of the controls in his hands, the thrill of flying through the clouds, the unmatched feeling of knowing that he was responsible for the lives of hundreds behind him. He clicked snooze. He wasn't ready to make a decision. But for the first time in months, he felt a stir in his heart at the idea of returning to the sky. That afternoon, when he returned home, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. He glanced at the screen, and for a moment, he thought he was mistaken. Sender: Richard Whitmore. He opened the email and read each word slowly. You were right, I'm sorry. No excuses, no justifications. Just 6 words. Michael sat quietly, staring at the message. Whitmore, once one of the staunchest loyalists to the corrupt system of Meridian, now sending him an apology. It couldn't change the past, couldn't erase what had happened, but it said one thing. People could change. He typed a simple reply. Apology accepted. The sky belongs to all of us. He hit send. Outside the window, a plane took off, soaring into the vast sky. Michael watched it, knowing the road ahead was still long, but whether he chose to stay with the FAA or return to the cockpit, he knew that the sky had now become a safer place, and he had helped make that happen. Michael sat silently at his desk, his gaze fixed on the blinking numbers on the computer screen, but his mind wasn't really there. Richard Whitmore's email still sat in his inbox, a reminder that even those who were once part of the rotten system could recognize their mistakes. It made him think more deeply about the road ahead. He had helped the FAA reform, contributed to new safety regulations, and ensured that the aviation industry would never repeat the mistakes of Meridian. But was that really enough? It wasn't just the system that needed changing, but the people within it. And that meant starting with the new generation of pilots. 7 months later, at the National Aviation Academy, Michael walked into a large auditorium. In front of him, hundreds of young faces were listening intently, all future pilots, the ones who would be flying commercial aircraft in the coming decade. They weren't the ones who had witnessed the collapse of Meridian, but they would be the ones to take over the aviation industry after all the changes. Michael placed his hands on the podium, took a deep breath, and began. I didn't come here to talk about the past, but to talk about the future. The aviation industry is not just a job, it's a promise. When a passenger steps onto a plane, they place their full trust in you. Trust that you are not just pilots, but guardians of their lives. That's a responsibility no one can take lightly. The room fell silent, the only sound being the hurried scratching of pens on notebooks. But there will be times when you are tested. There will be times when the system will ask you to bow your head to wrongdoings. There will be times when superiors will order you to turn a blind eye to a problem, all for profit or due to time pressures. And in those moments, you must ask yourself one question. Who will you be? Someone who accepts and bows down, or someone who dares to stand up for what is right? He looked them in the eye, his gaze firm. No one will praise you for choosing the difficult path. There will be losses, sacrifices. But the only thing that matters is this. When you sit in the captain's seat, you can be confident that you've done everything for the safety of the people behind you. A round of applause broke out, not too loud, but enough for him to know they had listened. He stepped down from the podium, and a group of young pilots approached, their eyes shining with admiration. One of them, a young woman with a brand-new pilot uniform, spoke up. You are the reason I pursued this career. Your story showed me that being a pilot isn't just a job, it's a mission. Michael nodded, feeling a quiet pride welling up inside. He wasn't seeking fame, nor did he want to become a symbol, but he knew that if he could change the way a generation of pilots thought, he had truly made a difference. 3 months later, Michael officially accepted an invitation to become a training advisor for major airlines. He didn't just teach flying skills. He taught ethics, the responsibility of being a pilot, and the importance of never turning a blind eye to safety risks. He trained pilots. He guided air traffic controllers. He held workshops with maintenance engineers to help them understand that their voices mattered. And most importantly, he didn't just impart knowledge. He conveyed determination, courage, and an uncompromising spirit toward wrongdoing. One day, after stepping out of a class, he received a message from James Chen. Atlantic Airways is still waiting for you. If you want to return to the skies, the captain's seat is always yours. Michael looked at his phone screen, then gazed up at the vast sky above. He had once thought he had to choose one path, either continue fighting within the system or return to the cockpit. But now, he realized he didn't have to choose. He could do both. He could continue protecting the skies, not just from regulations and policies, but from the cockpit itself. He picked up the phone and pressed the reply button. "I'll be back." Michael stepped out of the Atlantic Airways training room, feeling the vibrant atmosphere of a busy workday. The young pilots from the class were still standing around, animatedly discussing the simulation scenarios he had presented. Looking at them, he knew that a new generation of pilots was being trained with a different mindset, one that placed safety above all else, never compromising under pressure from the system. What he hadn't expected was that his story would go beyond the walls of the academy, beyond Atlantic Airways, and spread across the entire aviation industry. 2 years after the collapse of Meridian Airlines, an article appeared on the front page of the New York Times with the headline, "From the Meridian Scandal to an Airline Industry Reform. The pilot who changed everything. Michael read the article during a transatlantic flight, feeling both distant and familiar. He had never wanted to be a symbol, but his story had become a prime example of the cost of courage and the power of an individual standing up to a broken system. Airlines around the world had changed their safety policies, pressured by public opinion and new regulations issued by the FAA. Changes that had once been deemed impossible had now become the standard. Aircraft maintenance procedures were under stricter scrutiny with an independent monitoring system free from airline management's interference. Whistleblower protection laws were strengthened, allowing pilots, maintenance, engineers, and flight attendants to report violations without fear of retaliation. The FAA established a special committee requiring all airlines to have an independent internal safety oversight department with the authority to ground flights if any danger signs were detected. These changes weren't just happening in the U.S. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, ASA, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, also adopted similar measures, raising global safety standards. And it all started with one story, the story of a pilot who refused to remain silent. Michael had never liked being called a hero. He had only done what any pilot should do, ensure that every passenger who boarded a plane would land safely. But he knew that some had taken his story as inspiration to change the aviation industry for the better. One morning, while preparing for a long-haul flight, a young pilot came up to him. The girl, with bright, enthusiastic eyes, wearing an Atlantic Airways uniform with 4 gold stripes on her sleeves, a young captain ready to conquer the skies. "You're Michael Daniels, right?" she asked, her voice slightly hesitant but full of respect. He nodded, a little surprised. "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" "I just wanted to say that your story made me determined to pursue this career," she smiled. "Before, I was afraid I would never be able to speak up if I saw something wrong. But because of you, I know that the truth must always come first." Michael looked at her and recognized in her eyes the image of his younger self, someone full of ambition, believing that the sky was not only a place to fly, but also a place to fight for what's right. He smiled and shook her hand. "The sky belongs to all of us. Fly steady." She nodded and turned away, ready to step into her cockpit. Michael stood there for a long moment, feeling a sense of relief. He knew he had fulfilled his mission. Not through speeches, not through titles or awards, but through the real changes made in the system. His legacy wasn't in the headlines, it was in pilots like her, those who would continue to uphold the spirit, continue doing what's right, and ensure that no passenger would ever again board an unsafe plane. Michael took a deep breath and returned to his cockpit. The flight was about to take off, but this time, he wasn't just a pilot, he was part of a change that would last forever. 5 years later, the aviation industry had changed forever. Michael stood on the glass platform at the FAA headquarters, gazing down at the airport below. Planes took off one after another, carrying hundreds, even thousands of passengers to destinations around the world. They didn't know him, they didn't know the battles he had fought, but every safe flight that took off today was the result of what he and his teammates had struggled to change. The aviation industry was no longer what it once was. New regulations had been enforced, and airlines could no longer easily bypass laws or falsify maintenance reports. Pilots no longer feared speaking out about safety risks. Everything that Meridian had once hidden was now part of the blood-soaked lessons incorporated into the training programs of all major airlines worldwide. But Michael didn't stop there. At an international aviation conference in Paris, Michael stood at the podium as a senior advisor to the FAA. The room was packed with industry leaders, experienced pilots, and aviation engineers eagerly awaiting his speech. He didn't talk about the past, about what Meridian had done, or about those who had fallen because of greed. He spoke about the future. Safety is not a destination, it's a journey. Aviation will never stand still. We can't say we've eliminated all risks. Technology will evolve, airplanes will change, but one thing will never change: our responsibility to the people who trust us. His gaze swept across the room. I've witnessed the worst this system can produce. I've seen people willing to place profits above lives, but I've also seen people brave enough to stand up. And I believe we can do better. Let the lessons of the past remind us that there's no such thing as good enough safety. We must always do better. A long round of applause followed as he finished. But for Michael, this wasn't the end. This was just another milestone on his journey. One fall day, as he entered O'Hare Airport to prepare for another flight, Michael received a message from Zoe. "Do you remember the moment when it all began?" He chuckled, recalling that day, the first day he had been forced out of the meeting room, stripped of his flying opportunities, looked down upon just for daring to challenge the system. That day had probably changed him forever. But if given the choice again, he would still choose this path. He looked toward the boarding gate, where a group of young pilots was stepping up with passengers. Among them, one stopped, nodded at him. It was Tasha Williams, a young pilot he had once trained. Now, she was a captain. He nodded back, feeling a quiet pride swell within him. He had changed the aviation industry. But more than that, he had helped create a new generation of pilots, ones who would continue to protect the skies. Michael stepped into the cockpit, fastened his seatbelt, and gently touched the controls. The sky always held new horizons to conquer, and he was far from ready to stop. The journey of Michael Daniels is not just a story of a pilot fighting for the truth, but also a testament to how a single person can change an entire system. From someone forced to wait outside, he stood up, faced those in power, and made the entire aviation industry change. Today's skies are safer because of those who dared to speak the truth, who dared to fight for what's right. Does Michael's story make you think? If you were in his shoes, would you dare to stand up against a flawed system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.